The Livingstone family actually were small crofters on an island called Ulva on the west coast of Scotland. They lost their home and were lucky that losing their home sort of coincided with the mill at Blantyre being opened. They came to Blantyre where David Livingstone was born in March in 1813.
When Livingstone was born, you have the beginnings of industrial revolution. An industrial revolution which at that point is mainly water powered. So you have the cotton industry had developed to quite a considerable extent. The really big industrial revolution has yet to happen. The thing to realise about Livingstone is that quite phenomenal changes happened during his lifetime.
Livingstone's father worked for a little while in the cotton industry, which was the chief employer there, but then became a sort of tea seller.
He would actually use his tea salesmanship in the spreading of tracts, because his father saw himself as primarily a Christian missionary and evangelist.
And Livingstone went to work, as we know, very early on in the cotton mill in Blantyre.
At the normal age for starting in the mill, age 6, they said to him, "No, David, you're not going to the mill, you will stay at home and you will study." And they kept him at home studying until he was 10. A typical day for a boy like David. They would rise at the 5 o'clock bell, had to be in the mill before 6 o'clock. If you went in before 6, you were in danger of losing your job. He finishes at 8 o'clock at night and then has to go to school, a 2-hour school day between 8 and 10.
And with his wage from his very first paycheck after the first week, he went out and he bought himself rudiments of Latin.
He said that girls in the mill who weren't of his educational level would get jealous that he was reading and they couldn't read, so would play tricks on him. And they used to throw bobbins at his book in the effort to make the book fall into the machine.
Livingstone was immediately captivated by nature, which was something that was very much in the air at the time. There was a sense that there was a tremendous amount to be learnt from nature, the ways in which man related to nature and through nature to God.
There's a nice wee story where he had gone to a quarry and had been lucky enough to find fossils in the quarry. And he said to the quarryman, "How come if we are not near the sea, there are sea creatures in these rocks?" And the quarryman told them that God made them their rocks and put those sea creatures in them. And that was the extent of the scientific knowledge of fossils as far as David was concerned for quite a long time.
When he was about 14, he read a tract by a missionary who was also a scientist, who was also a doctor, Carl Gustloff. And he reckoned that you could have Christianity and science could both combine together. He then determined in his mind that he would teach himself enough so as he could go to university, become a medical doctor, and then he wanted to go on to become a missionary.
But David told his father he was wishing to become a doctor and a missionary, and his father was horrified that David should consider studying to be a doctor, since he believed that doctoring would be scientific, and that surely science went against the religious beliefs that David had been strongly brought up in.
Livingstone's parents, for a long time, they resisted some of the new ideas which were going around. For instance, they weren't initially sure that David would be suitable as a missionary, and then they weren't sure that he should study for medicine, not until they were convinced that you could put the two things, medical and missionary, together. Working in the mill, he got a more senior post and was able to put aside money regularly, which he did for his further studies. He was able to go on to his medical studies partly because he had actually already done a good deal of classical languages.
When David was applying for university, I think there probably had never been a child from a mill who had gone to university. And his application, I almost imagine they would have laughed at first. How could he possibly have the education for going to university? He was tested and they found he was certainly up to the job. He decided he would study the medicine first, general medicine. And he studied this at the Anderson Institute in Glasgow. And there qualifies as a general practitioner. He studies theology at the same time and finally applies to the London Mission Society.
London Missionary Society, it was the biggest of the interdenominational societies. Their simple aim was to establish mission stations worldwide.
Free trade, it was thought, was going to revolutionize the world by bringing peoples into connection with each other. And I think most missionaries thought in terms of these free trade ideas.
He travels to London and is tested twice and again found that he was up to the task. And David goes to a lecture by Robert Moffat.
Robert Moffat was a London Missionary Society missionary in Southern Africa, probably the best known.
And he had seen tremendous success through many arduous and hard years in Africa. And Robert Moffat said, by the light of the morning sun, he sees the smoke of 1,000 villages, beneath which they had never heard the gospel.
David becomes absolutely inspired by the man's speech.
And the whole Africa idea took off in his thinking.
Africa was the continent that was scarcely known. The phrase the Dark Continent was used quite a lot. Now the reasons for that are the coastal areas are reasonably accessible, but as soon as you go into the interior of Africa, you encounter an escarpment that rises up to a great plateau. The whole of sub-Saharan Africa is a high shield-shaped plateau, and you have to go up there in order to travel extensively. And part of the great defences of Africa, of course, were its insects. The two most significant ones, of course, were the mosquito, particularly the Anopheles mosquito, which distributes malaria. And the second was the tsetse fly. And the tsetse fly then injected this illness, which became known as sleeping sickness or nagana, into horses and cattle. So the only way really to penetrate the whole tsetse fly area was on foot.
LMS wanted him to go and join Moffat in Kuruman. He was happy with that. Moffat was the trigger.
Livingstone was about 27 years old when he set out for Africa. He left on December the 8th, 1840. And he was very astute in that he learned quite quickly to befriend the captain, and that was a major influence later on in his life because he learned how to use the sextant and to take longitude and latitude, which was essential in any map making, and that gave him the edge in exploration.
He reached Africa in early 1841.
From Cape Town he went on to Port Elizabeth and he travelled up to Kuruman.
To the mission station and began work. Now Moffat wasn't there at the time.
He thought that they had saved the whole of Africa by that stage. And so he was viewed by the others as being a bit too precocious.
We have to see Livingstone as a romantic. We have to see him as an idealist. And that was what fueled him to some extent. This is a good thing.
And so within a short while, he found himself further north at a station called Mabotsa. He would not just walk into the chief's village, he would sit and he would find out what the customs were of the people, what their culture was. And he would sit sometimes for days outside the chief's village and wait to be invited with an audience.
He did what you would expect a missionary to do. He learnt the language as and when he could. He settled down as much as he could, lived amongst them. He did medical work as appropriate. Not in an institutional sense. That is to say, if somebody came to him with a medical need, he treated them, but he didn't try to establish clinics or hospitals.
And he used his medicine together with his Christianity in trying to reach out to the people. You can imagine they would sit around the fires at night, talking, and Livingstone does give lovely, buoyant accounts of this. And so around the fire, he would engage with them, talking to them, and saying, well, how would you? You see Mwari, God, you have the spiritual belief, and I want to tell you that God so loved you that he actually sent his son. And he sent him all the way to die on a cross, to shed his blood, because there can be no forgiveness of sins without the shedding of blood. And so he would share this in their language, with their cultures, bringing the gospel of Jesus Christ.
David was living in a village where lions were a terrible difficulty for the village. We're talking of a village who had something in the region of 5 cattle, and the lions were preying on their cattle. So the people of the village really were concerned that it would be one of the children who would be taken next. And the men of the village went out to hunt the lions. David goes out hunting with the men. Generally speaking, the way they used to hunt was they would create a huge circle, maybe a mile wide. Then everyone would turn into the centre of the circle and walk inwards, making the circle smaller as they go, that way trapping any animals who were inside. And on more than one occasion, lions break through their circle. Eventually, David has a lion in his sights, a lion sitting on a very large rock.
Livingstone fired and actually shot the lion, but he didn't kill the lion. The lion turned around and grabbed hold of Livingstone and shook him, as in Livingstone's word, as a terrier does a rat. Mabalwi, who was Livingstone's assistant at that stage, he fired. Thankfully, you've heard that expression, a flash in the pan. It was just a big smoke coming up at the top, this bang. The lion then turned around and went for Mabalwi. But by that stage, the lion was quite weak and died. His whole arm was so badly broken that it actually stuck out. It was a compound fracture, and he had to put live maggots into his arm to eat away the rotting meat.
Travelled to Kuruman, and by the time he gets there, his arm is actually beginning to recover. His arm set very badly, unfortunately, and all of David's travelling through Africa was done with only one arm working. It wasn't completely useless. He could hold a book down low, but he couldn't lift it any height. He's nursed back to health by a young lady called Mary Moffat, and he marries Mary, who's actually Robert Moffat's daughter, in Kuruman.
And they set out to establish a new mission station further north from Mabotsa in an area called Chonwain. It was on the edge of the Kalahari Desert, so water was harsh for them.
It's during this period he makes great friends with Chief Seshele, because whenever he moved to a new village, particularly if he wanted to establish work, then he had to deal with the chief. Seshele was from the first interested in Christianity and indeed became a believer. Openly, clearly, definitely became a believer.
He did battle though with Seshele. The battle was with this drought, and they had to then move to this new area, Kolobeng, which was another mission station.
While he's living in Kolobeng, Chief Seshele's son takes ill. David insists on helping the medicine man, and they work together. Ever after that, everyone was saying, oh, David was superior and his medical work was greatly in demand. But David knew the importance of the medicine men and always worked together.
But the whole time, Livingstone became rather restless, and he wanted to get to this new paramount chief, Sebetwan, which everyone had heard about. His father-in-law, Moffat, was working with Mzilikazi. He wanted to get to this new mission station, but to do that he had to cross the mighty Kalahari.
Livingstone's great initial geographical achievement was to reach Lake Ngami, which he did with the help of one or two other travellers and hunters, and indeed his wife and early children actually amazingly went with him. And it was for that achievement that he was actually given the gold medal of the Royal Geographical Society, because he had established that there were great water systems even in what had originally been seen to be predominantly a desert area.
Once he had mapped the lake, his idea was to try and get to this area where Chief Sebetwan lived, this massive paramount chief. And that was still several hundred kilometers further north. And so they opted to come back and then restart the journey the following year and try and push further on. And that would be sort of northwest of what we now know as the Victoria Falls today. By that stage, he had discovered, after this months and months of crossing dry desert, he finds this place that's just flowing. It's God's highway of water into Africa. When he met Paramount Chief Sebetwan, that's when he came into problems with that beastly little thing called the mosquito. And he suffered from malaria. He realized that he needed to try and establish a mission station with high ground. High ground, in Livingstone's view, was a place that didn't have malaria, bad air. And they didn't realize that the malaria came from the mosquito. Malaria was associated with swampy area. He came back to Kolobeng at their mission station. Little Elizabeth Pine was born, and she died a few months after she was born, and that was a huge shock to Livingstone. They said, why do you keep dragging your family throughout Africa? He just saw himself with his family, but he took them through some arduous conditions. He was a tough man himself. And Mary, she was a strong Moffat who had married a Livingstone, and the two of them were a very strong pair. And they made 3 journeys to cross the mighty Kalahari. So he decided if his family could go back to Britain, be separated from him for about 2 years, he could look for this high ground.
Part of his objective in doing this was that he wanted to find out if there were any navigable rivers. He feels that what is really important is to understand the relationships of Central Africa to its western and its eastern coasts.
23rd of April 1852 saw Livingstone with a very tearful goodbye as his family left for Britain. A lot of people at that stage would turn around and say, Livingstone was an explorer.
Livingstone, he says, the end of the exploration, which appears to be for commercial reasons, no, that's the beginning of mission. We can explore, we can establish trade routes, we can establish stations, but having done all that, the purpose of that is so that people may come and preach the gospel.
Unfortunately, Sebetwan died to Livingstone's arrival at this time, Tilanyanti. The new chief, Sekeletu, wanted Livingstone to find this high ground, and he sent 27 porters out with him, and he tried to go as far as he could, but unfortunately, some of the tribes, one woman looked at him and said to him, no, you can't go into that area. You must come with me, and I will take you to the new paramount chief in this new area, which is Shinty. Paramount Chief Shinty, by the way, he was a very friendly fellow. He took off his conical beads, which was like a Lord Mayor of London, and he put it onto Livingstone. And he touched his heart with the conical beads, and he said to Livingstone, this is my heart and my friendship. And so there was a great bond and a great respect for Livingstone. They were given oxen and off they went. He saw something else that shook him and crushed him, the slave trade. That's the first time he really saw the slave trade, and he decided in his heart there and then he would set himself as flint to stop this open sore of the world. Now he was moving into these other areas whereby they, in order for Livingstone to go through, they demanded something. They had to have something. And they'd say, give up a man. And they said, no, we're not going to give up a man. And so they ended up having huge problems because Livingstone would not give a man up. He said, all right, I'll give you an ox if I can just pass through. But he found himself on the banks of the Kwango River, absolutely exhausted, fever-ridden. The tribe would not allow him to cross. And at just that very moment, on the other side of the river, the Kwanga River, a Portuguese patrol searching for honey happened to see upon Livingstone. They heard Livingstone, they called across to him, he said he was in distress. They crossed over and they said to Livingstone, we will take you back into safety. He crossed over the Kwanga River and collapsed. No one had gone into Africa and come out alive. And there he is, pops out in 1854 on Luanda, alive. Barely alive, but alive. And they said to Livingstone, you've arrived, you've plotted this whole interior. You just need now to get on that ship and go back to Britain. And he turned around and he said, no. And they said, why? Livingstone said if he just sent these people back, they would undoubtedly end up in the slave trade. Livingstone said, I will take these men back to Sekulete because I gave him my word. And Livingstone, once he was fully recovered, he set out, and whilst he had gone maybe on for about 3 months into his journey, a runner had caught up to him and said that the ship on which Livingstone sent all his documents, all his copies of his journals, had sunk, complete loss of life except for one person. Livingstone could have lost his life. And he made it back to Linyanti, just short of 2 years being away, to a rapturous welcome. 26 porters arrived. He would have got 27, but one found a wife on the way. And Livingstone said, Sekulete, there's not really a way to the west, but perhaps we'll follow this great Zambezi River. And he said to him, look, I will go, but this time I need to go all the way back to Britain. So will you allow me to be away for another 2 years? And Sekulete said, yeah, that's a good idea. I will give you. He gave him 114 men this time, on the understanding that they would wait on the east coast of Africa for Livingstone to return. They departed in November 1855. Interesting, within a few days, Livingstone discovered what he had known to be there for a long time, the Victoria Falls. The smoke that thunders, Musiatunya. By saying discovered, yes, we knew they were there. The Makololo knew they were there. But he was the first person to map it, longitude, latitude. He was the first person to measure it. He was the first person to then take out to the Western world proof that Victoria Falls existed. And he named it the Victoria Falls after his queen. And he had heard the other tribes had given it different names, so he said, so I'll give it a name as well. A chap by the name of Tuba Mokoro, which ironically means smasher of canoes. And he hired Tuba to pole him with this dugout across to what was now known as Livingstone Island, where this torrent of water was flashing past on either side. And as they were being poled out, Tuba Mokoro slipped, and he was able, with his weak arm, to grab onto some rocks. And he said, had he not been able to grab onto those rocks, surely they would have gone over the Victoria Falls. Gingerly, with this roar of water, Livingstone, and I've been to that very rock because he's described it so well. This crag and he just went on his hands and knees, and then onto his stomach, and he edged himself over this massive chasm.
Livingstone proceeded right down into Mozambique, and he thought that certainly at high water, during the rainy season in other words, it ought to be possible to navigate the Zambezi. His problem was that he'd actually missed out something. He had made a detour.
He cuts across one of the big bends in the Zambezi where the Kaborabasa falls and rapids are, which are completely unnavigable by ships. He doesn't realize that he hasn't taken this into account. So actually, he comes back to the coast and says, I found a way into the interior. It's via the river Zambezi.
When Livingstone returns, he has been gone for quite some time. He's already become quite well known because it's an era in which the press is expanding and the press is reaching a wider readership. And so there's a lot of press comment. There was a great fascination in what had now become the Victorian era, of course, for exploration of all sorts. I mean, the modern equivalent might be moonwalking, space travel, but there was a tremendous fascination for this. There was something exhilarating about seeing unknown parts of the world opened up.
The Victorian public liked heroes. They needed them. Today we may have, film stars and footballers. They had explorers.
He was much sought after, but he didn't really actually like it. At one stage he had to actually hide in a cab because the crowd saw him coming out of a shop and all wanted to get round behind him, all wanted to talk to him.
But then he tops all this off by writing his great book, Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa, which immediately becomes a bestseller. And when you read Missionary Researches and Travels, you find that it's hugely impressive from the point of view of its the powers of observation that are revealed there. He looked at the indigenous peoples. He was forever meeting Africans, of course. He was interested in what they grew. He was interested in the areas in which they lived. He was interested, of course, in the hydrography of Africa. By that we mean, of course, its river systems, the way in which water coursed across its geology. And he was interested in the geological history of Africa as well. And in his journals, he writes all this up in very considerable detail. And when he comes to write that book, he puts a lot of this information in it. And it's that which really impresses people like Sir Roderick Murchison, people like professors at Cambridge, William Whewell and Adam Sedgwick, who hail Livingstone as being a significant scientist. But in terms of medicine, his greatest influence was in thinking hard about malaria. I mean, malaria was endemic throughout the areas of Africa in which he travelled.
And it was Livingstone who worked out if you took quinine, which is still the last drug of use in attacking malaria today. If someone's that sick, they have to go on to quinine, which was, Livingstone worked out the use of it. So he mixed it with jalap and rhubarb and something else, and it became known as Livingstone's rouser.
But perhaps his more significant observation in this area was the tsetse fly. Now, Missionary Travels and Researches actually has an image of a tsetse fly on the title page. And I've always thought that that is very significant, because as well as the other scientific concerns that Livingstone had, he was interested in entomology. He was interested in the insects of Africa, and he was forever collecting and looking at things. And he began to recognize that you could not take horses or cattle into the area of the tsetse fly, which was very injurious to both animal and also to human health.
He spoke to the universities, Cambridge and Oxford. They got together and he spoke to them. And it was quite prophetic, because he said, will you follow in my footsteps? He said, there will come a time where I will be cut off, which is quite prophetic. I will be cut off there in the middle of Africa. Who will follow? Who will come and walk in my footsteps? Who will preach the gospel? Who will take it to these people? And there was a tremendous roar. People like Bishop Mackenzie, wow, I'm going to follow. And the university's mission began. It was a group of missionaries who were going to follow Livingstone's expedition.
He makes speeches which seem to be inspirational. It's a curious fact that Livingstone didn't have a good voice, it was always said, and a rather thick Scottish accent, but nonetheless he had a way of expressing himself which seemed to inspire people. And the other characteristic was the Royal Geographical Society, which had become a very celebrated body and whose publications and exploits were also getting a lot of publicity.
The Royal Geographical Society, they had him as a speaker, they awarded him with more awards, and he was sort of moving towards a bigger vision, a bigger picture. The London Missionary Society, £12,000, if not more so, in debt, battling to keep up with his vision. He wanted to open up Africa. He started talking to the Foreign Office in Britain.
And I think this meant all along that Livingstone had it in the back of his mind that if his interests, as he saw them, and that of the LMS clashed, then he would be quite prepared to quit. In effect, that's what it came to, because he was dealing at the same time with the British government, who were prepared to finance him on this Zambezi expedition and give him both the title consul that he needed and the funds.
The second Zambezi expedition was much more the traditional style of expedition, with a number of figures, all with their specific functions, including his brother, Charles, John Kirk, who was the botanist and doctor, a young man called Thornton, who was the geologist, an artist called Thomas Bain. There were a number of people who went off on this expedition with Livingstone.
On the 12th of March, 1858, the ship, the Pearl, under a night that was full of snow, slipped out from Glasgow. By his side, Mary and her youngest son, Oswald. The rest of the children, they had been put to stay with Livingstone's sisters so they could continue their education. Mary soon discovered she was pregnant. So when the ship docked in Cape Town, she had to actually travel up to Kuruman to be with her parents for the birth of their baby. Livingstone carried on all the way to the mouth of the Zambezi River. The Ma Robert was put together. It was, in Livingstone's words, a wretched sham of a vessel. It leaked like a sieve. And the other thing, because Livingstone hadn't gone down the Zambezi on a boat, he didn't grasp the fact that the sandbanks were there and that they moved. And the sandbanks were a treacherous thing, because the crocodiles would wait on the edge of the sandbanks, and that people would have to get off the boat and push the boat over these sandbanks to try and dodge the crocodiles. So it was a treacherous time. So it took them forever to finally get up to Tet. And all those men who were waiting for him, and they said, "Livingstone, you've returned." They said you'd never return, but you've returned. By that stage, they had 114 men. Many of them had married. Many didn't want to go back. They were hearing these stories being passed from tribe to tribe, and finally they get to them that this Sekeletu is just killing people, his own people, and ruling them with a rod of iron. Fear struck them. They didn't want to go back with Livingstone. A handful went back. And now he heard about the rocks in God's highway. What were these rocks? He saw one set of rocks after the other set of rocks. And they saw a horrific sight. That was horrific to Livingstone. A 30-foot high waterfall. This was truly a rock in God's highway. That was now a huge problem for Livingstone. The Ma Robert couldn't go further north. Livingstone had to carry on. He went back to the Makolola people. Sekeletu was a very much diminished man. This very strong paramount chief was now diminishing. Livingstone got to him, he nursed him and helped him with his leprosy with Kirk. But it was a tense time, very tense. And you talk to anybody, Sir Ranulph Fiennes, when you push people onto an expedition of nature, the pressure, it is like a pressure cooker. And so there was this huge pressure cooker put upon them.
The biggest problem with the Zambezi expedition was Livingstone. He was a great pioneer, but he was not a good leader of other people. He expected from the rest of the team his sort of Herculean ability to carry on in the most adverse conditions. Well, that's all very well, but other members of the team were not quite made of his stuff, and he should have realized it. He should have allowed for it.
Again, Livingstone's, his desire, if you got the fever, you walk. You try telling that to somebody who's dying of malaria. Oh, wait. And then Charles goes and turns around and says, well, Baines is stealing. What's he stealing? Oh, he's stealing food. He's stealing this. Now, probably in all reality, Baines was down with the fever. When you're down with the fever, you're not going to sit there and mark a checklist and say who's taking what. Now, Baines resigns. And with some say he resigned, some say Livingstone fired him. The decision was made that they would have to try and return. But in the meantime, he started to go up the Sherry River. He found some cataracts there, and he called them the Murchison cataracts. No one had really mapped out the Sherry River, which Livingstone mapped. When I say mapped, before that map, it was just an empty blank space. He filled it in. And he found some high territory, which they were desperate for. By then, the university's mission had come out. You've got Bishop Mackenzie and others, and they're coming out in Burrup and Dickinson, and they're all coming out now. So this is positive, this is good. Finally, the Ma Robert, it took in the last gulp of water and sank. But in the meantime, the government of Britain had sent out another boat called the Pioneer. Then they found out that there was this other river called the Rovuma, which was further north. And if they could use this Rovuma River to open up, we could get out there. There was this other lake. They knew this lake, Nyasa, was there, but it hadn't been properly mapped. Perhaps the Rovuma flowed into that lake. Let's find out. And now you've also got huge problems with the Portuguese, because Livingstone's shouting at them for being involved with the slave trade. The Arabs are there, and there's tremendous friction going on. They travelled up the Rovuma and they found out that the river was going down as much as 3 inches in a day. And they thought, let's hold on here. We better return, get back to the Zambezi and try and go up the Sherry River again. He got to the bottom of Lake Nyasa, found horrific evidence of the slave trade.
It was during this period, and I think probably was the most important outcome of the Zambezi expedition, it was during this period that he came head on against the slave trade. All along Lake Nyasa and Lake Malawi, slave trading was going on. That whole area was impacted by the slave trade in quite dramatic ways. The evidences were fairly gruesome often, dead bodies and skeletons lying beside pathways and villages razed to the ground because they had tried to resist the slave traders, and actually came across the trade in practice on one occasion, actually using force to free the slaves from the slavers. But now it was impinging upon him on a sort of day-to-day basis, and it gets a higher and higher profile in his journals and in his letters and in his appeals. Livingstone says, cannot the love of Christ carry the missionary where the slave trade carries the trader? Cannot we penetrate Africa for the love of Christ in order to bring them the gospel and freedom and all that the gospel means? That was tremendously important to him. In fact, I think it sums him up in many ways.
Livingstone said they counted 300 bodies that were caught in the wheel, just the turning wheel of the Pioneer. There were so many bodies that even the crocodiles were ignoring eating them. The rot, blood flowed down the Sherry River.
Because they were using the Shire instead of the Zambezi, they needed a smaller steamer, and Livingstone paid for that himself out of the proceeds of his book. And it was called the Lady Nyasa, in the hopes that it would sail one day on Lake Nyasa.
And that came out in 40 sections, together with Bishop Mackenzie's sister and Livingstone's wife and another member of the party's Burrup, his sister. In
the end, the plug was pulled on the Zambezi Expedition. They ran out of money. The British government was prepared to subsidize it up to a certain point, but they kept on building new steamers and sending new supplies without any tangible results. But a far greater cost was the human cost. Bishop Mackenzie died, as several of his co-missionaries died, and Livingstone's own wife died.
And there was a house there in Shipanga, and Livingstone took her in to this house and he laid her on 3 T-tests. And she was very, very sick. And she started to sink into a coma. And Kirk's diary gives the most tragic but eloquent explanation, because he said Livingstone was kneeling down next to Mary, weeping as a child.
The expedition really was, in personal terms, a disaster. In geographical terms, it wasn't as successful as it might have been. And in religious terms, it showed up all the problems of trying to establish mission stations in Central Africa. If you were to say, well, did anything come out of it? The answer is that the route up into Malawi did become better known. The delta of the Zambezi became better known. So there were certainly some favourable geographical results.
So the Pioneer was handed back to the Royal Navy, to whom it belonged, but actually the Lady Nyasa belonged to Livingstone. And he argued, logically enough, that if he sold it to a local dealer, it would be used for the slave trade. But he didn't want to just abandon it in some East African port, Zanzibar or something, and he heard that he could get a good price for it in Bombay. So he, with virtually no trained staff in the sense of sailors, experienced sailors, sailed across the Indian Ocean to Bombay. An extraordinary feat in itself. On returning home, he got a cooler welcome than the first time, and that wasn't surprising. The expedition hadn't done well. That doesn't mean to say that he wasn't still a famous personality that people wanted to meet. The Royal Geographical Society continued to be very interested in what he had to say. People in the Christian world were still saw him as, a pioneer missionary, which he was.
His next book came out, The Zambezi and Its Tributaries. That actually came out after he left.
It wasn't as good a book as the first one. He co-authored it with his brother Charles, and it did one very significant thing, which was the slave trade was very much at the centre of a lot of the comments in the book, and that widened the appreciation of that problem in Britain.
There is this great geographical conundrum that everybody is worrying about at this time, and that is, where is the real source of the Nile?
Who would find the source of the Nile? The Royal Geographical Society said, we'll give you £500, Livingstone, if you would go and find the source of the Nile for us.
That was one of his objectives. His other objective was to expose the slave trade of the East African coast more than he had been able to do in the past, because of course he'd been travelling more in the south central region, in the Zambezi region. Now he has moved somewhat further to the north, and he's right in the track of the so-called Arab slave traders. And his third objective was finding yet fresh fields for missionary endeavour.
He took his daughter Agnes to a finishing school in France, and then just quietly got onto a boat and sailed back to Bombay, where he collected his porters, and he set out on the third expedition of his life.
He started from Zanzibar and then went up the river Rivumma. Again, same pattern, will this river connect us with the interior?
Most people would have 100, 120, 150 porters. Livingstone had but 63 of the worst kind. He ran away with his medicine chest. That was a huge blow to Livingstone. And he was reported dead, actually, in December of 1866 by some of these porters who absconded from Livingstone, and so as to get paid by Kirk, who was now in Zanzibar, they said, oh no, we need our pay, but Livingstone's dead.
He circled around the southern end of Lake Nyasa. The river didn't connect. And then westward to these two new lakes, Benguela and Mweru, and on to Lake Tanganyika, where he established a centre at a place called Ujiji.
Ujiji was crucial. It was a known Arab slave route and traders' route.
He was actually well off the beam in the search for the source of the Nile. He found himself in the headwaters of the Congo, and he found himself within minor river systems and lake systems in what's now northeastern Zambia.
He had this incredible tenacity, and he always believed the Lord would make it right in the end. One stage he was kept outside this village for days on end, and the chief who was involved in the slave trade refused to even feed Livingstone. And this old woman with her leprous hands kneaded Livingstone some porridge, pushed it to him and said, "Take it, you must eat. You are very weak." How many men, how many people would eat food cooked, kneaded with leprous hands?
He was always, in a way, vulnerable. You know, he was always at their mercy. There was hardly a time when he brought superior power to any situation, and yet he survived.
Livingstone did travel, I think, as an unthreatening person. He was unquestionably very brave, very courageous indeed. There is a very famous moment when he meets some Ngoni people in Malawi. They were of Zulu stock from Natal, and he meets them and they're pretty threatening. And he rips open his shirt and bares his chest, and he says, "Look, I'm white. I'm an Englishman." And he does use that word. "I'm not a Portuguese." Because he thinks that the Ngoni might think that he's Portuguese and he's therefore mixed up in the slave trade and might therefore be somebody that they can cheerfully do away with. And he even succeeds in establishing a relationship with these people who were pretty formidable.
He had his loyal handful of servants, bearing in mind the 63 crowd of porters had dwindled to only 11 faithful, of whom was Chuma and Susi. Chuma was part of a slave gang that Livingstone actually set free. Livingstone's gone, not 1 year, not 2 years, not 3, 4 years. No one's heard of him. Tragically, Livingstone's now suffering in the middle of Africa.
Nobody knows where he is. It was one of the great mysteries of the age.
So you get this sort of strange business where he is lost but not lost, dead but alive. There's news, but there's not enough news. We want more news.
And various expeditions were sent into Africa to look for him, and generally discovered that the stories that he was dead were untrue.
This proprietor of the New York Herald, Gordon Risden Bennett, was a very, very wise, astute businessman, as well as a man who knew a good story when he saw it.
So Gordon Bennett thinks, I have an opportunity here to get the most phenomenal scoop of modern times.
He got hold of then probably one of the bravest young adventurers, journalists, a young man by the name of Henry Morton Stanley. And he called Stanley into his hotel room in Paris in France one night, and he said to Stanley, "Do you think Livingstone is alive?" And Stanley said, "I don't know." But he very, very wisely said, "But I do know it will cost a lot of money to find him." And it was interesting because Gordon Risden Bennett, he said he slammed his hand onto the table and he said, "Find me Livingstone if he's alive, or bring me his boots if he's dead." He said, "In the morning you will draw 500 guineas. And when that is finished, you draw another 500 guineas. And that is finished, you draw another 500 guineas. I don't care what it costs, but you find me Livingstone."
Because you have to remember that this doesn't happen fast in the way that it would today. It's a very slow burn. Once he's consulted with Sir John Kirk and the British Consul General in Zanzibar, he then heads off into what is now Tanzania and marches off across towards Lake Tanganyika. It's a long journey.
The other thing, Stanley was no pushover. His expedition, that was 700 people, and he didn't mess around. He had copper pots, just big massive baths, the whole lot. He even had this white stallion.
Stanley begins to get word that this white man is traveling around, and he finally meets him at a place called Ujiji on the shore of Lake Tanganyika.
Livingstone was sitting there outside his hut and heard this unbelievable fanfare, trumpets going, this commotion. Here you have Stanley, and as Livingstone said, the biggest American flag he ever did see. And with his famous hat, he walks up to the doctor, who had by then stood up, raised it and said those immortal words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." And with tears in his eyes, Livingstone picked up his cap. Stanley said, "I have come to find you." And Livingstone quietly said to him, "I wasn't lost."
Stanley developed a tremendous admiration for Livingstone. Livingstone became almost a father figure to him. You have to remember that Stanley was illegitimate, and he never really knew his father, and he saw in Livingstone somebody remarkable.
And he persuaded Stanley to go with him on one adventure, as it were, and that was for an expedition to see whether the river Luzizi flowed into or out of Lake Tanganyika. They found that it flowed into Lake Tanganyika, and as a result of that, it could not have been the source of the Nile. And that expedition took several months, and finally, after almost a year coming up to it, Stanley said, "I have to go back."
He tried to encourage Livingstone to leave with him. Livingstone didn't. So you have to realize that through all this amazing story, the outside world still doesn't know. And it's only when Stanley gets back to Zanzibar that he's able to unveil to the world the fact that he's actually achieved his objective.
For Stanley's cry from Livingstone was heard in the Western world. Livingstone's words, "May heaven's richest blessing come down upon Englishman, American or Turk, who will heal this open sore of the world." And the Queen, in the opening of Parliament, indicated that the slave trade would be stopped and it would be enforced by her navy.
And eventually, the British, in effect, although this doesn't happen until the 1890s, force an anti-slave trade treaty upon the Sultan of Zanzibar. But it was the most phenomenal journalistic scoop of the 19th century. And of course, it opened up for Stanley tremendous fame, which of course he didn't have before that. And Gordon Bennett has his achievement, he has his scoop, he makes his newspaper in New York one of the most celebrated in the world. Livingstone carries on with his travels, searching for the source of the Nile, which had become his obsession.
So he thought that he could circumnavigate Lake Benguelu and this whole marshy area, which is vast, and that by doing that and mapping it, he would find out whether or not this absolute wet area, the sponge, was probably the sponge being the source of the Nile.
Those last days of Livingstone, of course, became very much part of the legend. The reality was that they must have been absolutely miserable for him. He was very ill. Amazingly, he kept going. He was being carried in a type of hammock. He was passing through very wet and uncomfortable regions. By this time, his followers do seem to have been genuinely devoted to him.
And he ended up in Chief Chitambo's village, which is on the edge of Lake Benguelu. They basically built him a hut, and that night they stationed a child by the door. Late in the night, he came and he woke Susi and Chuma, and he said, "It's because the doctor does not move." There he was, by the light of this tiny little candle, and it burned lower and lower. He was kneeling down. And they slowly walked up to him and felt him. and he had died kneeling in prayer. And they said to each other that he's a great white man and he must be buried with other great white men of his own country.
They symbolically plant his heart beneath a tree, and they then proceed to sun-dry the body so that it went through a form of embalming. Now, this was very difficult for them because they didn't want to tell the people round about that he died because of the reactions that they might have faced. His journals were carried out of Africa just as his body was.
It was an incredible journey that they embarked upon with Livingstone's body. 10 men died. It took over 9.5 months, and they crossed over 1,500 miles.
Through many areas where people might have objected to a body actually being carried through the territory. So they had to kind of obscure what they were actually up to. They proceeded to wrap him up, make him look like some kind of other cargo, as it were, and headed down to the coast with him.
I mean, most of us, you had a dead body on your hands and you were thinking of transporting it all that way over that difficult terrain, would have got rid of it as quickly as we could. It was their way of saying this man matters to us. So we have to remember that he was loved by Africans. He wasn't just somebody who sort of came in and gave them this strange message and then went off again. The people who knew him best, the people who travelled with him, loved him.
Now, from that moment onwards, it is amazing because no less than the Royal Navy itself is deployed in order to bring the body of Livingstone back. And his body is brought back. His funeral is in effect a state funeral, with the senior politicians, representatives of the royal family, all present. And of course, he's buried in a very prominent position in Westminster Abbey.
What shook the whole of London was that the atmosphere was of total respect, and the funeral was the biggest gathering of people, over 20,000 people, since Lord Nelson was dispatched.
In their memoirs, missionary after missionary after missionary says that they were influenced by the great story of David Livingstone and the books that he wrote. So he's phenomenally influential.
He teaches us we are not to give up. We are to have a fearless faith. We are to persevere, and we are to set our minds on that which we cannot do when we get to heaven, and that is lead another person to know Jesus Christ.
Missionary, enterprise of perhaps of a different sort has got to go on, until Jesus comes again. And he's still saying to us, go into all the world, go into every sort of situation, familiar and unfamiliar, and make disciples. He's still saying that to us.